Okay, so ask anyone what their favorite FNAF game is, and it's usually safe to say that FNAF 2 is one of their favorites, if not their favorite game in the series. And there is good reason for that, at least on paper. So am I being a little dramatic with this title and thumbnail? Well, maybe, but I do stand by that opinion, even though it may be a controversial one. And of course, feel free to disagree with me and discuss anything you may agree with or not in this video, but to me, yeah, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is kind of overrated. And let me explain why I believe that. But before I get to why I think FNAF 2 is one of the weaker games in the series in my opinion, let me take a moment to speak on why many people in the community actually love FNAF 2 so much, and why it might be their favorite. And just to be clear, just because I think it's overrated and one of the weaker entries, I don't by any means think it's a bad game at all. Just when it's compared to the other games, especially ones that I feel don't get enough credit, I think it's one of the weaker ones. But why do people love FNAF 2? Well, it was such a step up from the first game in terms of mechanics and gameplay. Where the first game was very simple at its core with very little interaction, it was still a great horror experience that had not been done really before. However, you could play it only for so long before it became, well, boring. Sitting there night after night with not much to do besides wait to be attacked and then shut some doors. Yeah, that can get a little tiring after a while, and Scott knew that. So with the second game, he sought to make it require much more attention from the player, to hopefully make it more engaging and more replayable, which in a sense I think he achieved. Instead of just lights and doors, now you have a mask that you can use, lights, cameras, and of course the music box, which we'll get into how I feel about all that later, but you definitely can't take away from it that it does require more from the player. Not to mention that the game actually has 20 animatronics compared to the mere 4 from the first game. A lot of people also really like the lore this game introduced, and I can agree with some of that. For example, this game introduced the purple guy, who we now know as William Afton. Basically the main character and antagonist of the entire series. And there's a lot more, including how the animatronics became possessed, and it's all told through these interesting and creepy minigames, which I do think are a nice touch. And of course, you can't forget to mention the multitude of theories that arose from this entry, seemingly giving more questions than answers. I mean, this was basically the prime time of theories for the series, so good on you, Scott. But yeah, that's basically why everyone loves this game. But let me tell you why I don't love it as much. So, starting with the gameplay, it's true that on the surface it is more complex than the first game, but first of all, while this game may have 20 animatronics, they really only fit into a couple categories in terms of gameplay. Either they enter your office via the vents or hallway and you just need to put on your mask to survive, or you have to shine your flashlight down the hall. And then of course there's the puppet, which you just have to wind the music box to avoid. And while it may seem like a lot to worry about when you're first playing it, quickly it becomes a pretty trivial affair, with there being a pretty much unbeatable strategy. That being the classic vents, hall, music box, mask, and repeat until you beat the game essentially. And that's kind of the main problem with this game, which a lot of people have talked about before me, but it's that there's this unbeatable strategy. Because as I see it, FNAF was always supposed to be a horror game series, a horror experience before anything else. And so it's kind of strange that a seemingly random death that could catch you off guard would be absent. It's no fluke that FNAF 1 and 6 are probably the scariest in the series. It's because there is no unbeatable strategy. And even if you think you've won, you can always be killed no matter the strategy, and it will keep you on your toes at all times. Whereas in FNAF 2, if you die, it's just kind of your own fault, and while that makes the game more fair to an extent, it greatly diminishes the horror aspect in my opinion, which is the fundamental genre of this game series. And to sacrifice any scare or horror value for that, I don't think is worth it. So if you die on a 2020 run, are you really scared? No, you're frustrated or regretful of a mistake you made while playing. Also, yeah, the cameras, they're pretty much useless once you have the strategy down. Of course, except for camera 11, which you need for the music box, which, why is that remotely done? And why can't it just be on all the time? Whatever. So yeah, adding more mechanics, making it more complex I guess, does add more replay value, but it makes it far less scary and really just kind of a tedious experience after you've mastered it and played it for some time. As for the new animatronics this game introduced, well, these toy animatronics, yeah, these are not it. I don't think I could have thought of a less menacing and scary design if I tried, really. Maybe except for like the mediocre melodies, but still, really? On the bright side, Mangle is a classic, and the puppet's alright before you get into the story, which, well, we'll get into that. And the withered animatronics are great as well. Suitably creepy designs, especially Bonnie. The jump scares, on the other hand, kind of lacking, and obviously they aren't the worst in the series, but the lack of movement from most of them, as well as this kind of just strange sound, doesn't really work too well in my opinion. But now for the story. So this is where my take is probably going to get the most controversial, but let me just say off the bat that the story isn't awful by any means. But I do think some of these plot points as well as the timeline got pretty wild even this early in the series. So we know this game takes place in the year 1987, as revealed by a check received after one of the night shifts. And FNAF 2 is a prequel to FNAF 1, I'm sure you all knew that, but bear with me here. So yeah, I think to make the game more interesting mechanically, Scott really just jumped the shark in terms of world building and believability. As in 1987, they somehow have programmed full-on robots, aka the toy animatronics, to be able to detect criminals using a criminal database and have them attack them on sight. Now, this doesn't really make sense for a lot of reasons, but first of all, it's 1987. And I know this doesn't necessarily take place in our reality in our own timeline. And hey, maybe robotics just developed faster in the FNAF universe. But still, these toy animatronics themselves aren't really animatronics in the traditional sense. They're kinda just full-on robots that were programmed to do actions, such as walk around on their own. Whereas animatronics from the first game were much more realistic, being based on the classic Chuck E. Cheese animatronics, which would do only basic actions, and definitely weren't able to walk. That's what made them so creepy in the first place. Seeing these animatronics move around and stalk the player, even running down the hall, it subverted our expectations based on our own experiences with reality. But these toy animatronics just straight up walking around and attacking on command, it's just a little bit too wild in my opinion, at least for this time span. And if it was Scott's intention to go this route, he probably should have made it a game that takes place in the future and not in the past. Also, how does the legality of these even make sense? I mean, I'm not really gonna get into that, but yeah. But I think the biggest issue is that they're not even possessed or anything like that. They're just straight up robots trying to kill the player. There's nothing supernatural going on, nothing creepy, no paranormal anything going on. I mean, these guys aren't even creepy to begin with, but really this story this early on was already just getting into sci-fi territory. Then you have the puppet, which is a whole other can of worms because, well, the tragic story of her being the first victim of William Afton and eventually putting the souls of the other murdered children into suits was, I think, pretty good. The actual puppet itself doesn't really make sense, and maybe it's just like I'm nitpicking here with this, but the first game is just so much more grounded. Even the third and fourth games as well. At least if you disregard all the crazy retcons that were made later on, but we're not going to talk about that. So yeah, the puppet, or the marionette, whatever you want to call it, is what again exactly? Well, if it's just a puppet, I would be cool with that. I mean, he just got possessed, okay, that's fine. But no, I guess somehow it's supposed to be an animatronic? Like, what? Where does the endoskeleton even go? Does it even have one? How does this thing operate? And if it somehow can operate without an endoskeleton, then why do we even need them in the first place to make the other animatronics? And I'm saying all this because somehow the puppet was apparently a security measure and was able to track Charlie based on like a green bracelet or something, and that's how she was able to possess him, as he was able to get to her after she was murdered. 1987, by the way. But yeah, that kind of just wraps it up, but my thoughts all in all, it's not a bad game, just not one of my favorites in the series, but definitely not the worst. That goes to, yeah. Maybe that could be another video. But it is my least favorite of the first 4 games, being that I think it's the least scary while also being the most tedious, as you have to continually just go back and rewind the music box, shine lights, mask, repeat, without any real fear of losing or getting, well, scared. There is also some good lore and world building, such as with the creation of the iconic William Afton, but there is also some very strange world building, like having criminal detecting robots and animatronic puppets in the year 1987. It kind of just makes it a lot more fantastical and a lot less mysterious and interesting as a dark, paranormal, but realistic setting. Overall, not a bad game, just overrated.